Well, greetings out there in YouTube land, and welcome to this impromptu video, which is going to be part 4 of the Reverb series. I thought we'd concluded things in part 3, but it turns out that that is not the case. A very knowledgeable viewer brought to my attention that there was a serious problem here in part 3 with the presentation of the wet reverb signal. Let's take a look at what was wrong with that and see how we're going to fix it, and then repeat certain parts of the sound checks that were performed here in part 3 with a properly functioning 6G15 reverb unit. I think you'll recall when we get to this portion of the video and I was cranking in the wet signal, this type of jaggedness here was attributed to the reverb effect. There, dueling hands. But a viewer brought to my attention that this fuzzy worm effect here is not a result of reverb at all, but a result of something called parasitic oscillation within the 6G15 reverb unit. Now, I did not recognize this as an example of parasitic oscillation, primarily because I have never used an oscilloscope on an amplifier that had it. I've never seen this pattern before. And I'm betting a bunch of you haven't, or have ever heard of the topic itself. So I think this is a great opportunity to discuss a rather elusive topic of a parasitic oscillation, to see what causes it, the harms that it can cause within the amp circuit, and how to resolve the issue. Then let's move on to a retesting of the 6G15 once it's been treated and cured for this affliction, and see what the Reverb Tank really sounds like when it's operating properly, and compare the 6K6 and 6V6 tubes. So if this sounds interesting, if you're ready to go explore something that a lot of us never have a chance to see or explore, then stay tuned, because here we go. I think this would be an excellent opportunity to discuss the topic of parasitic oscillation. It's something I'd heard of, probably a lot of you have heard of, but I didn't fully understand. So let's go through briefly through this outline and discuss the different elements of it. The definition: it's a positive feedback loop inadvertently created within an amp circuit, generating an undesirable signal. In other words, some error in wiring or component failure or something is creating a positive feedback loop within the circuit. Now, we're familiar with negative feedback loops, and I think a lot of you know what happens when you hook up your negative feedback loop to the wrong output transformer secondary wire, and you get that howl. Well, the problem with parasitic oscillation is it is a howl, but it's often hypersonic, which means that it creates a signal that is above your level of hearing. And what's wrong with this is that this tremendously strong signal can be created within the amp, overdriving the circuit and causing all sorts of damage, and you are not aware of it because you can't hear it. The causes: some of the output energy is coupled to the input, so it's like the dog chasing its tail. The output stimulates the input, which increases the output, which increases the input, and it just goes in one grand circle of self-destruction. The specific causes can be capacitance between adjacent input and output wires, absence of grid blocker resistors, and common grounding of input and output leads, where if you develop a ground loop within the grounding of the input and output leads, you can actually have a circuit be closed between the output and input, and you'll end up then with the cause of parasitic oscillation. Okay, the harmful effects. The circuit can actually develop a radio frequency signal, which is way above human hearing. that it will broadcast and actually disrupt nearby electronic devices. It can actually cause an audible noise, but generally, from what I've seen, in this case, not. It may generate excessive heat in the tubes, output transformer, and can destroy your speakers. Imagine that you have a boost pedal, and somehow or other it can boost the signal within the amp to outrageously high levels, but you can't hear it do this. Can you imagine, any of us who have ever used a boost pedal know that the output transformer, among other things, gets rather warm, as do the output tubes, due to this overdrive. Well, this is more or less an invisible overdrive that can occur within the amp circuit and cause all sorts of excess heating and destruction of amplifier components. And it can also cause the amplification of your audio signal to be non-linear, which means certain parts of it, like you have an equalizer that's gone nuts. And many times it will boost the treble output so high that it becomes very harsh with all sorts of distortion. Think about in the part 3 video when the 6K6 tube was tested and provided that harsh sound. Now the cures. And now I'm going to use these cures in attempting to resolve the parasitic oscillation problem within my 6G15 reverb tank. And I'll show you while I'm doing it. We're going to adjust the lead dress. In other words, we don't want an input and output wire to be close together where capacitance can couple them so that we create the positive feedback loop. We want proper biasing of our output tubes, and we want to add, if necessary, grid blocker resistors immediately before the grid of each tube. Now that is going to more or less put the brakes on the dog chasing its tail. If it encounters a resistor each time it tries to enter the grid of the next tube, the signal will be slowed down and reduced to below an amplification factor of 1. And the oscillation cannot persist. So I'm going to try these pretty much in order and see which one of them fixes my 6G15. And finally, the classic visual representation on an oscilloscope of hypersonic oscillation is that the oscilloscope trace will appear as a fuzzy worm. Does that bring back any memories? Think about what it looked like when I cranked in that wet signal. So let's go out to the workshop and see what we can do to kill the fuzzy worm and get a better comparison of our 6V6 and 6K6 tubes. Jack is definitely a cat of many quirks, but probably the strangest of them all is his insatiable appetite for Scotch tape. He doesn't really swallow it, he just loves to chew it. I don't know if it tastes good. I guess I'll have to find that out for myself. Go, Jack. Nice job. Okay, we're back in the workshop. The signal generator is turned off. It's generating no 1,000 cycle per second input. The 6G15 is turned on with the dwell at about 2.5 out of 10. Now with no signal input whatsoever, you can see a high frequency oscillation is taking place within the circuit of the 6G15. That should be just a straight line right across the x-axis. Now when I turn on the signal generator and put a 1,000 cycle per second signal into the 6G15, as I did in the previous video, you'll see that we have our dry signal here. That's the 1,000 cycle per second signal. But when I shift over here to show both, there is our parasitic oscillation, which is adding to or joining with the 1,000 cycle per second signal and giving us the false impression that it is a reverb signal where it is not. When I go purely to the wet signal, you see that it is combining the parasitic oscillation with the 1000 cycle per second signal and giving us that fuzzy worm that we saw in the last video. So, just to make it clear, this is not the result of reverberation. It is the wet signal, but it is the result of some sort of parasitic oscillation within the wet circuit path. Okay, step one, let's replace the 6V6 with a known to be good RCA 6V6 GT. And the fuzzy worm returns. Apparently then the original 6V6 that I had in the unit is not responsible for the parasitic oscillation. Let's take a look though at what a 6K6 looks like in this position. Okay, this is the same General Electric 6K6 that I used in the original, and the fuzzy worm returns. It looks a little different than the 6V6 tracing. It's a little smoother, but you can see that the oscillation is still present. Okay, we have the 6K6 tracing over here on the scope. I'm going to go in and move around wires using a wooden stick, and I found a couple that seem to affect the width of the tracing. It changes it significantly. And the wires, I will show you in just a second, are these two here that are running very close and parallel. They are to the plate and screen of the 6K6 tube, which is the one in place here. So let's separate them. You notice I used a tie here to hold them together. Let's separate them and see what happens to the oscillation pattern. Okay, I separated the two wires and lifted the plate wire up and away from these three mixer wires. Let's take a look at the trace. The fuzzy worm is gone. What we're seeing is the 1000 cycle per second signal that I'm injecting. There is no parasitic oscillation. All right, now that the wires have been adjusted in their positioning, let's see, using the oscilloscope, what the conditions are within the circuit. This is the dry 1000 cycle per second signal. This is the wet 1000 cycle per second signal with the dwell at 0. Let me show them both to you. Now I'm going to crank up the dwell so that the wet signal starts to receive the 1000 cycles, and you can see that they coincide almost exactly. There is no fuzziness, and therefore the parasitic oscillation is gone. Now this is great news as far as the circuit goes, but we really don't see much difference, do we, between the wet and dry signal. One of these is through the reverb tank, one isn't. It's hard to tell them apart. I really see no visible evidence of reverberation taking place, which is kind of a letdown. So let's plug a guitar into the input and take a look at what the oscilloscope sees in the circuit when a guitar is stimulating the tank rather than a 1000 cycle per second signal generator. Now for comparison of the dry signal versus the wet. This will be the dry signal with the guitar strings palm muted, and I will strike them in order beginning with the large E and working my way up to the small E. Notice how the frequency increased. With the lower E, you saw about half of one sine wave, whereas with the higher E, you can see 3 complete sine waves, much higher frequency. Okay, now we'll look at the wet signal, doing exactly the same thing. I think you can notice a whole lot more wave activity as a result of the echoes and reverberations that are present in the wet signal. Okay, let's see if we can differentiate between the wet and the dry tracings on the scope when they appear simultaneously. There, you can see the fairly smooth sine wave that is the dry signal, and that spiky mass that is the reverb signal. The difference is really quite obvious. Okay, now that the 6G15 parasitic oscillation problem is resolved, I'm going to repeat the side-by-side comparison of the 6V6 and 6K6 because I really think we might have gotten a false impression of what both tubes sounded like because of the problem that existed within the circuit of the 6G15. So let's try both tubes at 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, and wide open dwell. The mixer and tone will both be straight up at 12 o'clock. Okay, here's the 6V6 at 2.5 out of 10. Now the 6K6 at 2.5 out of 10. $66 at 5 out of 10. $6K6 at 5 out of 10. $66 at 3/4 out of 10. $6K6 at 7.5 out of 10. $6V6 at 10 out of 10. $6K6 at 10 out of 10. Well, I guess that's about it for this supplementary video. I hope that the discussion of parasitic oscillation was interesting and informative to you all, as well as watching how, in my case, I was able to eliminate it from the circuit. I feel that in the comparison that the 6V6 still provides more reverb than the 6K6 at the same setting. I guess it's a matter of personal taste, whether you want that or not, but at least the 6K6 came through in this comparison, I think, sounding a whole lot better than it did in the first one. I guess this would be just one more reason to get an oscilloscope, since much of the parasitic oscillation is hypersonic, so you really can't detect it with your ear, and have to resort to diagnosing it through symptoms. like unexplained output tube red plating, even though the tubes are biased properly, unexplained harshness, especially in treble frequencies, and things like that, overheating of the output transformer, all rather obscure problems that you generally would not dream up are due to an invisible and inaudible source. So let's take all our newfound knowledge and go back to the car show. I appreciate you watching, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next video. Bye for now. Check this out. It's another person that I'm friends with. Talk about nice. The old 5-window pickup with an absolutely immaculate engine. Just beautiful craftsmanship. Look at that power wall. It's not easy to do. Really slick. Look at that. Instead of chrome on the front, he went with kind of a wrinkled black. I think this really looks nice. This is a great truck. Here's another neat old car. A friend of mine owns this. 2-door sedan. Notice the shaved door handles and some really slick pinstriping. There's a local guy who's just a genius that does the pinstriping for us. I really like the interior he put in, very understated with a tweed. Nice dash. He drives this all over. It was just down in Austin, Texas recently at a big car show that they had down there. Let's take a look at the rear. Oh, an old-fashioned George Barris trick with a recessed antenna. Pretty slick. Don't look at that reflection. I'll have to tell Robbie to not polish his trunk so well. Well, not quite the winner in the how low can you go category, but he's getting there. Old El Camino with a tasteful X-rated mural and the Traditionals Car Club. Kind of an unremarkable interior, and to me, wheels and tires that are just way, way too small. Well, here's one that's not to everybody's taste, but you got to admit, the workmanship and money invested is incredible. Look at this thing. The visor. The old air conditioner. I remember these. You put water in here, it's an evaporative cooler. And the thing I always liked is when you would turn to the right, the water would kind of rise up and come in through the chute and pour all over the passenger, which I guess cooled them down. Once again, tires and wheels that are, to me, way, way too small. But beautiful workmanship. Look at the woodworking here on these wooden slats and that cutout with the Chevrolet emblem. Got another Traditionals Car Club member. Brought his car washing supplies with him. Let's get a look at this paint. If you can, I don't know how well it'll come through on the video, but metal flake silver. Talk about cruiser skirts. Jeez, need a crane probably to take them off and put them on. And look back here, he's got his air compressors for his air system to raise and lower the rear end. Like I said, not to my taste, but pretty impressive as far as workmanship. Here's a deceptively simple and very impressive car in my book. Look at this thing. Look at the dash. Automatic. Beautiful leather work. And it is leather, I can tell you. In the sun, there's no doubt from the smell of it. Okay, the raked windshield. And more engine than he has a right to. Good sized tires and wheels, and very, very expensive and beautiful wheels. All in all,
magnificent car. Well, here's another entry in the what the hell category. Look at this thing. Looks like an old AA altered. Blown small block Chevy. Spoked front wheels. Probably, what, 33, 34 body. And a 3-window. It's hard to see. I'll go to the other side. Then we get a better view. And nice, small, narrow rear tires with a semblance of tread. This is one of those cars that when you're feeling real cocky out on Saturday night with your, oh, let's see, what are you going to be driving in? A 65 Mustang. And this pulls up next to you. That's when you start to develop humility. Okay, get the windows down. Look at the interior. Yep, I think this would be a definite lesson in humility. Here's another car that was built by a friend of mine who built that the black 40 Ford and the white 32 Roadster. This is 32 3-window coupe, and he specializes in doing things that are not, they're sort of understated, very tasteful, and just fabulous craftsmanship. That engine is really something to behold. Beautiful car.